Would you please turn to 1 Peter chapter 2? 1 Peter chapter 2. The foundation of any structure is probably its most important component. Great care and attention to detail must be applied to make sure that each succeeding aspect of the project comes out just right. If the foundation's out of square, then the walls are going to be out of square. And if the walls are out of square, then the roof's not going to line up. For a residential project, 10 to 15% of the cost is going to be in the foundation and dirt work. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center took 5 years to build, but the first 2 years, nothing was above ground level. They spent 40% of the project building the foundation because they were going to build the tallest structures in the world at that time. Unprecedented foundation work was necessary for a project on that scale. Now, our human lives need a solid foundation as well. Parents strive to establish a foundation of morals and faith. Schools and teachers and parents try to establish a foundation of knowledge in each student. What is it that you build your life on? Is it some certain ability that you have? Is there a philosophy? Is there a one-liner, a mantra, a phrase that you use to build your life on? Some build their life on family and others on simply what works, pragmatism. The Bible calls us to build our life on the foundation of Christ. It uses the phrase, we're going to read it here in a moment, that Christ is the cornerstone, the foundation of our life. But what does that mean? It can get cliched to say, build your life on Christ. It can get kind of cliched. So I want to drill down. 1 Peter explains that some to us. And I want to move into 1 Peter chapter 2 for our series called The Rock. We've been talking about Christ as the rock, the substance, the foundation of life. And we're using some examples from the Old Testament. And then in the New Testament, 1 Peter 2 today, very clear teaching of what the Scriptures are all about. So as we go into 1 Peter, a couple of things to note about 1 Peter. It was written by the disciple Peter a few decades after Jesus' life and death and ascension to heaven. It was written to persecuted, suffering Christians, Christians that were having a hard time, Christians that were discouraged, Christians who were beginning to doubt whether they had made the right decision to follow Christ or not. The emperor was Nero at the time, and the people were learning, these new Christians were learning that they couldn't depend on the government. Many had been condemned by their family for crossing over to faith in Christ. Their jobs or livelihoods were affected, possibly had lost them. Sometimes people today face hardships after coming to Christ. And now and then a person will begin to say, why is this happening to me? I gave my life to follow Christ, and all I'm getting are problems. It's gotten more difficult since I've chosen to follow Christ. I'm having more troubles. Why is this happening? To people who are having doubts, that's who 1 Peter is written to. To people who are struggling because of difficulties in their life, and they thought when they came to Christ that everything was going to work out and it was all going to go smooth sailing. That's who 1 Peter was written to. So let's read, starting in chapter 2, verse 4, and we'll read down through verse 11. Coming to him as to a living stone, rejected indeed by men, but chosen by God and precious. You also, as living stones, are being built up a spiritual house, a holy priesthood, to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Therefore, it is also contained in the Scripture, behold, I lay in Zion a chief cornerstone, elect and precious. He who believes on him will by no means be put to shame. Therefore, to you who believe, he's precious. But to those who are disobedient, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. They stumble, being disobedient to the word to which they were appointed. But you are a chosen generation, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, that you may proclaim the praises of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light, who once were not a people, but now are the people of God, who had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. It calls Christ the cornerstone here, the foundation to life. And so as we get into this, I want us to understand what it is that a person finds when they build their life on Jesus Christ, when they make Christ the cornerstone. Verse 4 uses the phrase, coming to him. So it tells us that the first thing we're going to find is an open invitation. Coming to him is in the present tense. It means come to him and stay there. Come to him and continue moving forward in that. Now, this open invitation says that we don't have to clean up our act in order to come to God. We can come to him the way that we are. I love how Romans 10 and verse 13 says, whoever calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. I love in Matthew 11 and verse 28 when Jesus says, come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Come to me. Open invitation. Please come. Please come. But then he goes into this and he says, coming to him as if Christ were a living stone. A living stone. It's this picture of salvation, that whoever calls on the Lord comes to him and finds life. They find hope and strength. And so we talk about hope. It's a living stone when you come to Christ. Now, stone we think of as not really alive, but when we come to Christ, we find a living foundation to our life. Jesus Christ is our living hope, we sing here. Christ has life to the full from the beginning, and he raised from the dead. And having Christ as the cornerstone of our life, as the foundation, means that there's hope. There's a fresh start, a new beginning. It's not the end of anything. It's the beginning of something when Christ is the foundation of our life. Now, it's fascinating who's writing this and saying, build your life on Christ. Because this is Peter. And there have been some throughout the last couple thousand years that have said, Peter was the foundation of the church. Peter was the rock of the church. And Peter's saying, build your life on Christ. He's the foundation. He's the substance upon which you build your life. Don't build it on flawed humanity, but build it on Christ, the source of hope. It's also interesting because Peter was called Cephas, a stone. Jesus, when he met him, said, I'm going to call you Cephas from now on, like you're a stone. Like you can become a person of substance and stability and strength. And Peter, Cephas, a stone, says, let me tell you about the real cornerstone of life, the one upon whom you should build your life. We think of living stone, we think of hope, and then we think of strength. God is our rock, our fortress, and our strength. How many times have people said to me, I don't know what I would do facing this trial if I didn't have God. I don't know what I would do if I didn't have the Lord. How do people do it that don't know God? Now, people often look within themselves to try to find their strength, their capacity. But sooner or later, every one of us get to the place where we need God, where we realize, I do not have the strength and the capacity to continue. I don't have it in me. Psalm 18 and verse 30 says, as for God, his way is perfect. The word of the Lord is proven. He's a shield to all who trust in him. Who is our God except the Lord? And who is our rock except our God? Living stone, not only strength, not only hope, but a duration there. You know, you pick up a rock, and that rock has been there for hundreds of years. It's been in existence. Duration. And it'll be in existence hundreds of years after we're gone. And that, in a lot of ways, is God. He's existed from eternity past into eternity future. And we put our hope and trust in Him. We're putting our faith in the one who will be there and the one who has been there. Because anybody else we put our faith in, any other organization, any other individual. A lot of people have built their lives on their business, and they gave themselves to an organization, a corporation, and none of those last forever. None of those last. Others put their faith in a person, in a relationship. And it doesn't last, it can't last. Because humanity doesn't. And yet we read in Matthew 28, the last phrase in the book of Matthew, "Lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age." Hebrews 13 and verse 5, "I will never leave you nor forsake you." When we build our lives on Christ, we've got an open invitation. We have a hope, we have a strength, we have a duration, a sustaining endurance. But there's something else this verse mentions about Christ. Coming to Him as to a living stone, and then look at this phrase, rejected indeed by men. There's a limited acceptance of Christ. It's not a popular message. It seems like forgiveness of sins, eternity in heaven, purpose and meaning in your life. It seems like they would be lining up out the doors, and they'd be piling into the meetings at Kansas State, and they'd be piling into our missionaries' churches around the world. But there's something in the human heart that says, I want to be my own boss. I want to be in charge. Nobody's going to tell me what to do. Nobody's going to push me into anything. Nobody's going to force me into anything. There's something in us that says surrendering to the Creator of the universe is not what I'm about. Jesus said it was a narrow road, and few would find it. And how we long for the many, how we long for the masses, how we long for the crowd. That text that Tasha shared from Matthew chapter 9. Jesus saw the multitudes, and it broke his heart because it's a narrow road. When you tell someone the good news, by the way, and they reject it, they're not rejecting you. How many people are afraid to tell somebody about the Lord? What if they reject me? What if they turn me down? They're not rejecting you. They're rejecting God's authority in their life. So that verse tells us that Christ is rejected by men, but chosen by God and precious. So we find chosen and then honored or precious. Fascinating contrast there. Rejected but chosen. And I guess we kind of have a decision to make in our own lives. Am I going to build my life on the acceptance of people or the acceptance of God? It fascinates me that Christianity originated in Nazareth, a small backwater town. Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? And if somebody's going to build their life on Christ, they've got to come to terms with the fact, I'm building my life on the narrow road. I'm living in contrast to the values of what culture says are important. And if somebody needs culture to affirm them, if somebody needs a group of friends to affirm them, if somebody needs the overwhelming affirmation of this world, they're going to struggle to come to Christ because he was rejected by men, chosen by God. So when we come to Christ, verse 5, he begins and he says, you also as living stones, he continues. We have this open invitation to Christ. Here's what we find: hope and strength and endurance and limited acceptance. But you also as living stones are being built up a spiritual house. He says Christ is the living stone, believers are living stones. Again, it's Peter, Cephas, telling the Christians that they're living stones. What does that mean? Well, we have hope and strength and endurance, duration. The same attributes apply to Christians. The word Christian means little Christs. Christ is called the Son. We're called sons of God. Christ was called our high priest. We're called priests. Christ was called the Lamb. We're called sheep. Christ was called the living stone. We're called living stones. And notice what it says here. As living stones, Peter's telling these believers, you're being built up a spiritual house. What it tells us is that God is building the church. But it's not brick and mortar, it's not metal and wood. It's people are the building materials. And God is fashioning, gathering, assembling, building the church. He said, I'm building up a spiritual house with all these different building materials. Look around, we're building materials that God's molding and shaping into his church. And God brings together all of those different building materials that he wants to be the church. He's cutting and he's shaping, he's refining until we all fit together. Ephesians 4 says, until we all come together in the unity of Christ. So if you're going, when one part of the body, if you're going through a hard time, man, it feels like I'm getting cut and trimmed, and this area of life is getting exposed, and this area of life is getting trimmed away. That's God at work. That's hope that he's building the church, his people. Not only hope, but there's strength there. As living stones, there's a strength. Steel is tempered, wood is kiln dried, and then often pressure treated to make it stronger, to make it last longer. So if you find yourself being squeezed, baked, or fried, thanks, because you're becoming a stronger building component for the building that God's creating, the church. As living stones, there's a duration to our faith as well. He says, you're living stones. God's building in us a faith that lasts. It's not a 4th of July firecracker that blows up and it's gone. God intends for our faith to sustain over the long haul. We've referenced a book that I love the title of, and we developed a series a few years ago, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction. Eugene Peterson describing the Christian life. It's not a brief obedience, hey, I did that and I'm off the hook. It's a long obedience, continuing to follow the Lord. Now this spiritual house God's building, he's giving us somewhere to belong. This living stone image for each of us tells us, gives us some implications. It tells us, for example, that we're part of something bigger. God's work on earth. When Jesus gave the model prayer, he said, your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And God calls us to assemble together, to grow together, so that we get his will accomplished on earth as it is in heaven. We were called to be part of something bigger. We were called to belong together with the family of God, the church, and to work together. We were not called to isolation. This spiritual house has many building components. Your portion of the building is needed. Your portion of the building is needed. Your contribution is needed. Your contribution is needed. God gathers the church together, part of a larger whole. Now, some people isolate out of superiority. Nobody there's good enough. Look at all the flaws. Look at all the mistakes. Look at all the people that are all messed up and they don't do anything right and they mess up over there. And so some people isolate out of superiority. None of the churches I know of are good enough. Some people isolate out of inferiority. I'm not good enough. I've got this flaw. I've messed up over here. I've messed up in that way. They wouldn't want me there. God wouldn't want somebody like me there. And yet I come here to 1 Peter and it says God is gathering all these building materials together and he's cutting and he's shaping and he's refining to make all of us fit together till we all come to the unity of faith, to the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. We're all in the process. And so if somebody thinks they're superior and that all the rest of us are flawed, I guess just come join the rest of us hypocrites, right? Isn't that the big word? The church is full of hypocrites. And I remember a few years ago I showed a picture of a guy it was before the Royals went to the World Series, so maybe 10 years ago. They were pretty bad. And the guy was reading a book on the front row of the stadium right behind home plate. And I thought, I wonder how many people are going to see that hypocrite at the stadium and not go to games anymore. Well, there's hypocrites all over the place. And besides, we don't come for each other. We came to build our life on the cornerstone and then to become the best building component that we can be. I also notice here from Peter, he says, God is building a spiritual house and then a holy priesthood to offer up spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. Peter just called all Christians priests. Peter did not say there was an elite group of people that would handle priestly duties. One of the great doctrines of Scripture is the priesthood of all believers, that we don't need some intermediary to represent us before God, that we all have direct access to God the Father through Jesus. We have direct access. Now, Peter then does what all of us should do, and that is he uses supporting scriptures to back up what he just said. So he just said Christ is the foundation of life, the cornerstone. So in verse 6, he quotes from Isaiah chapter 28 and verse 16. He says, I lay in Zion a cornerstone, the chief cornerstone, Jesus Christ. Then in verse 7, those who believe in him, the stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. So in our culture, there's this general rejection of Christ, but that's the one he calls us to build our life on. The stone which the builders rejected. And I thought builders, the influencers of our culture. Hollywood and the politicians and the media and the culture rejects Christ. Mocks those that build their life on him. The movers and shakers resist anything to do with God. Romans 1 uses the phrase suppress the truth. But look at verse 7 again. The stone which the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone. Here's how I was thinking about that. No matter how hard our culture works to reject God, reality keeps interfering. Here's what I mean by that. When Roe versus Wade, let's go to the discussion that's relevant for us in Kansas. When Roe versus Wade was decided by 7 men there on the Supreme Court, sonograms were not in use. And so this decision's made, and then sonograms are invited. And what do sonograms reveal? They reveal a beating heart. They reveal a life. They reveal limbs and extremities and such. It was over a century ago when Darwin came along, and he says evolution, and they began to actually, Planned Parenthood started as a result out of evolution, and Hitler's Nazism started out of evolutionary thinking. And then within the last decade, they discover soft dinosaur tissue, collagen, inside what they thought were fossilized bones, And that collagen cannot exist more than 10,000 years. And they've discovered the dinosaur, what they thought were fossils from millions of years, are really only 10,000 years old. And no matter how much they suppress the truth, reality keeps intruding. All the efforts to change a person's circumstances and the environment they're in, and yet the darkness of the human heart keeps rising to the surface. Medical breakthroughs and advances, and yet life is still 100% fatal. Reality keeps intruding, no matter how much humanity seeks to suppress the truth. And one day, every knee will bow and every tongue confess that Jesus Christ is Lord. If God would just write it in the sky, then I would believe. If he would just announce that he's God. And then DNA is discovered. And every cell of every living thing shouts complexity, shouts designer. He did write it. Better than in the sky, he wrote it on every single cell of every living organism. Creator, designer. The storms of life are a reality. The issue is, what have you built your life on? What are you building your life on? And when we come to Christ, we recognize there's a limited acceptance. This is like the narrow road. There's not going to be a day when this is the most popular thing going. But what you find is hope. What you find is strength. What you find is an enduring capacity. Would you stand with us, please? There's so many options on which we can build our lives. I pray you seek to make Jesus Christ the foundation of your life. Would you bow your heads with me, please? God in heaven, the foundation of Christ is the only one that makes any sense. It's the only one that's stable and lasting. It's the only one that is wise in the face of storms, in the face of limitations, in the face of our own weaknesses. I thank you that you provide hope. And God, all of us get to a point where we realize, I don't have what it takes. I don't have this in me. I need Christ. Thank you for the chief cornerstone upon which we can build our lives.